All right, so we've covered things like how to sort of really mind map your concepts, really sort of do some background reading, get as many concepts and ideas, kind of link the ideas and start thinking about what type of information you want and where you want to try and get the information from. What we're going to be moving into now is actually looking at things like how you actually sort of search. Now, in this sort of big diagram that I've got over here, I've got a few sort of ideas of like search syntax and everything over here, which you can view in a bit more detail later on, that sort of summarizes some basic terms that we're going to cover. I'm going to race through them. I'm not going to spend too much time on them because it's better for me to show you how these work with demonstrating them. But so on the one hand, it's about this idea of thinking about as many synonyms and plurals as you can. So for example, if we're talking about bushfires, with bushfires, it's not just, again, I should get rid of that second S over there, but don't worry. Bushfires, it's only really a term that's used in Australia. You don't really want to, Americans don't use it, Europeans don't use it, and all of those sorts of things. So wildfires is sort of the broader term, but then you've also got specific things like forest fires. So the idea is be aware of these other terms that you might want to be using because they're going to be providing you with a broader sort of idea of what you can be searching. What you also want to be doing is playing around with what's called wildcards and truncation. So these are things you're going to use in databases, with academic databases. And again, I'll go into a bit more detail about this a little bit later, but the idea is that if you're searching a term that has like the normalize over here does, where it's got the American spelling and then the Australian spelling, rather than having to search the term twice, you can just use this little wildcard, which will do that for you. It seems like something that a database should do for you as it is, but this is because academic databases, they function slightly different to the way, say, Google does, where if you write something like, say, bushfires into Google, it will kind of go, oh yeah, you mean wildfires and you mean forest fires and all of this, because it kind of recognizes that these are synonymous. When it comes to academic databases, they actually need you to be a lot more specific. The good thing about this is that it does mean that the results that you're going to get are actually going to be a lot more on topic. They're going to be a lot more specific and more relevant to what it is you're actually looking for. The downside is if you're doing something like using the word, say, normalize, you have to make sure you account for this, which is why the databases have these little sort of wildcards that you can use. Or even if you're searching something like bushfires, if you search the word bushfire, and there's an article that only ever uses the word bushfires, the database isn't actually going to give you the result that uses this term because you've only searched this term. That's why having this little sort of asterisk over here will search both bushfire and bushfires and give you the maximum number of results like that. Again, it seems like a real pain, but the actual reward you get from it, which is that you get more relevant results, is actually really, really worthwhile. There are also ways that you're going to be sort of combining your ideas and your topics. So, for example, with the top one, I'm saying I want something to do with bushfires and with post-humanism. So this is essentially me I'm using and to tell the database that I want only results that have both of those terms. If the term only has bushfire, I don't want it. If it only has post-human, I don't want it. I want bushfire and post-human over there. Conversely, you may want to be in a position where you want something where you're not particularly fussed about which term it's using, and this is where you would use or. So I'm basically telling the database, I want the word bushfire or wildfire, but because I'm not particularly concerned, because these are synonymous with each other, more or less, I'm actually not too fussed about which one it is, so it gives you the full list of the results. Then you've got this last one over here, which is not. Now, I'm going to be honest, there's very few occasions you actually need to use this one, but it can be a particularly valuable tool. So the example I've given here is you might be looking at something to do with object-oriented ontology, but you don't want anything that talks about eco-ontology. Now, that's a very weird thing. I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing a search like that, but if you were in a position where you wanted to do something like that, using NOD is a good way to make sure you only get things that use this term, no overlap, and nothing that just uses the other term. So it's a great way of doing that. An example that I could use is, let's say I'm looking at, say, architecture, like I want to do post-humanism and architecture, and then I find I keep getting things about computer architecture, which is a fairly accepted term, but we're talking essentially about coding and all of those sorts of things. I might then do a search which says post-human and architecture, not comp, so COMP with a little asterisk at the end. And then I'm basically telling the database I want things to do with posthumanism, architecture, but nothing that uses the word computer in there because I want actual physical architecture, not computer architecture. Like I said, it has very limited applications, but it can be useful if you find yourself in a situation similar to that. And, oops, sorry, let's go back to that one, is this idea of group searching. So here it's a case where what you're going to be doing is you're either going to be using the exact phrase search. So for example, if I'm searching object-oriented ontology, because it's multiple words and I don't just want an article that's talking about regular ontology, I would put that term into quotation marks to make sure I'm only getting results that use object-oriented ontology and not just ontology. It's basically a way for you to say, I want this exact phrase. And then you've also got the grouping words together. Now, this is essentially about putting these brackets together. Generally, you would only really do this if you're basically saying, I want this or this, because the idea of bracketing these things together is that you're saying this is a concept, and these are the synonyms for the concept. That's essentially where you would be using those. Now, if those don't really make sense, don't worry. I'm actually going to do a bit of a few searches now, which you can basically use to sort of kind of see this being illustrated a bit more specifically. So I'm just going to go out of this and just go to the library homepage. Now, I'm going to start by just searching the library catalog. The reason why I'm doing this is because the library catalog has been updated recently. We actually changed the back-end systems that we're using. So you're going to be searching it a little bit differently. The big advantage is that now you can actually search for articles and books in a single search. However, I would actually still recommend when you're looking for articles, I would use a more specialized database like ProQuest, and I'll explain why you would want to do that in a second. With the library catalog, the main thing you're going to be searching that for are for things like books. At the moment, print books are still available if you are able to make it onto campus. So if you are able to make it onto campus and you find that there's a book in the library catalog you want to get, you can still be getting it. However, I would say before you do that, double check over here, right in smack bang, it's talking about library updates around COVID-19. It is a situation that's changing pretty much. I mean, seems like hourly at the moment, but check this out. We're going to try and stay open for as long as we can, basically, unless New South Wales Health actually tells us, like, no, you guys need to close. We're going to try and be open so we can still service you guys for physical materials. But like I said, double check this for all of that. So when it comes to searching the library catalog, I would actually recommend searching the library catalog with very, very broad terms. So I'm, for example, going to search It's a very, very broad term. Technically, I should be putting a hyphen in there, but because of the way the library catalog searches, it's actually quite good. It'll basically kind of add the hyphens in for me and everything like that. Now, the reason why I'm searching just very, very broad terms is also for the same reason I don't recommend searching for academic articles here, which is that when you're typing in the search up here, what it's basically using to present the search results is the metadata of each of the catalog items. So just kind of explaining this so you guys have an idea. So when I search object-oriented ontology, you can see it's gotten that from the title, and then it's gotten it here from the title, a couple of the subject headings, although not specific subject headings, and then this over here as well. And so this is basically the extent of what it's searching. So now there may be chapters in this book that talk about object-oriented ontology around sort of environmental factors in a lot more detail, but because that isn't explicitly mentioned in this metadata over here, it basically means that the catalog isn't actually able to search that. That's not a problem if you're looking for books, because books generally you'll find they tend to be on broader topics. And this is where the books become really, really valuable, because if you're wanting to get like a real grasp of something like object-oriented ontology, then reading a book about the subject will actually be really, really great, because academic articles, whilst they're really, really high quality and really good information, they tend to be on a very, very specific topic. You'll see when we do a search in ProQuest a little bit later, a lot of the stuff, it's very much object-oriented ontology and this very, very particular specific thing, which is why that's great if you've got a fairly good grasp of the topic, but using a book is a great way to sort of beef it up. It's kind of the opposite of when we were using Google or Wikipedia, we're kind of using it to sort of get terms that we can use, get ourselves familiar with the topic. Here you're kind of bringing that idea full circle and you're using it to really develop your depth of knowledge around the topic. So as I mentioned, the library catalog now searches for books, but it also searches for articles as well. As I mentioned, this could be really, really useful. The other problem, however, like I mentioned before, even when it's looking for articles, it is searching just this metadata over here in order to give you the results. Now, this is actually still a really, really interesting article that you could read if you're interested in posthumanism and object-oriented ontology and those sorts of things, but it's not really ideal if you want to sort of look for something a bit more specific. You can do more sophisticated searching in something like ProQuest. So what I would suggest doing if you are searching the library catalog, the first thing I would do is go down here where it says resource type on the left-hand side and just narrow the search to books. And if we do find ourselves in a position where the library is closed, or if you are simply not able to get onto campus for various reasons, you can also select this available online option. And what that will do is it will actually just refine the searches specifically to items that are available online, rather than you having to physically come and get them in. And then you can get the items just by clicking on available online and then following the link that will show up over here all the way through. Okay, so that's the best way of using the library catalog. But as I mentioned, for academic articles or peer-reviewed articles or scholarly articles, whatever you want to call it, I would suggest using something like ProQuest. Like I said, firstly, it allows you to have a more sophisticated search, as I've got one over here, and I'll explain all of this in a second. But what I would also suggest doing is, the other reason why it's really great is because generally when this shows you search results, it does it based on the full text search of the article, which is actually really, really helpful, because it means if you're searching for something that's a bit more detailed like this, so for example, here I've got a three-parter where I'm talking, different types of sort of object-oriented ontology, different sort of like ways of describing like the landscape or the environment or something like that, and then this idea of catastrophe. It's a great way for me to make sure I'm kind of covering all of those bases, because they may use the word catastrophe somewhere in the text of the article, but not in the metadata, and that's why something like ProQuest is really useful. So to sort of describe this a little bit over here, so I've got a bracket over here because these are all sort of synonymous terms that I'm using. So I'm using object-oriented ontology, eco-ontology, and landscape ontology as roughly synonymous. I've got the phrase searching with the little quotation marks over here. And I've got the ORs because the idea is I'm happy to get either one of these. I'm not necessarily looking for one in particular. I'm just going to retype that one over there. Oh, nope, let me try search this just to see what happens. Okay. Let's start fresh. There we go. Yeah, so the idea is it will sort of give me any of these without necessarily being too fussed about which one it is. Then I've done and, because I don't just want this side of the search, I want the things following. Then I've got another bracket, and here I've got my various synonyms for that. And what I could actually do is actually use, so I've got landscape, scapes, etc. And then here I've got atmosphere, and then this will basically now search atmosphere or atmospheric, etc., etc. And then I've got environment and nature as well. And then here I've got catastrophe, which is sort of another one that I could use, and I could even go something like that, in which case it would search catastrophe, catastrophic, etc., all of those sorts of things. So that's essentially what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about, a more sophisticated search that you can do in one of these sorts of databases. So I'll now click on search. It will have a bit of a think, and then it will give me the results that I'm looking at here. So I've gotten 77 results. That's not too bad, especially considering it's gotten the sources from a few different places. Um, but then what you can do is you can really start to sort of narrow down the search to find things that are potentially a bit more useful to you. Now, the first thing that I would recommend doing, it depends on what you're looking for. So if you're looking specifically for peer-reviewed scholarly content, I would definitely use this peer-reviewed and the scholarly journal filter. I would make sure I use both, because if I just do scholarly journal, it will limit to 67, and then if I go peer-reviewed, it'll narrow it down a little bit more to like 62, because it doesn't necessarily always overlap. But I'm just going to remove both of those for the time being and just get the full list of the results. And you can see here, like, this is actually giving some really useful stuff, because it's actually letting us sort of think more broadly about, this is kind of what I was talking about, this idea of searching as an iterative process. It's the idea that I may be looking at object-oriented ontology to do with the environment and nature and those sorts of things, but now I've gotten a dissertation over here by someone who's looking at William Gibson's Neuromancer, and that might actually provide me go like, oh, I had actually never thought about, checking out sort of a cyberpunk angle around this sort of topic, and it gives me another way to sort of think ahead about this or look forward to it. It was actually by doing one of these searches that I came across the term eco-ontology, and here's the particular a review of the particular book that sort of looks at that. And then you can kind of go through, and it's also got like Carl Jung and speculative realism, and all of these other sort of things that you can use as well. Another thing that's really great about this is it does, even though you would search this for scholarly journals, you can also look at sort of magazine articles and newspapers and everything like that as well. So those are also some really useful things that you can use in that particular thing. Just to sort of like, if I do limit it to just scholarly articles, it's talking about, here it's talking about Lord Byron and the Romantic era and all of those sorts of things. So that's another way you can think of it. Ethics in the sublime and the problem of representation. So here it's also talking about, climate change and object-oriented ontology. So it's this idea that it's a really interesting way for you to actually find more results and then refine your searches later on. You may want to take, after reading this, you may want to take a more archaeological sort of approach in terms of what you're sort of looking at and what you're sort of studying. Or as I mentioned before with that one about William Gibson, it might give you another sort of way where you can add in some more sort of fictional material. And then what I would do is I would come back over here to the library, and I might look up something like, just do a search on cyberpunk, see what the library's got on cyberpunk, and then go through and see what I can find from that. See if I can find a copy of William Gibson, etc., etc. So it's again this idea that we were sort of talking about in the first video about searching as an iterative process. It's not something you're going to do once and then that's going to be it. It's all around this idea of playing with your search terms and playing with your ideas and finding ways of connecting it. We spent time on the mind mapping earlier, but I would also say don't get too fixated on keeping the mind map solid. Like, don't focus on like, no, I've done this mind map, I've connected these ideas a certain way. It's like, no, this needs to be fluid, it needs to be, play around with it, because that's the only way you're going to do it. And this is what brings us, if we kind of come back to here, this is what sort of brings us to the next thing, because once you've searched, you're then going to evaluate, you're then going to have a look and see, like, what have you found? So if I return to this ProQuest search, like, before I was talking about things like bushfires and all of this other sort of stuff, and I haven't used any of those terms in my ProQuest search. The reason is I actually did a few searches before, and like whilst I was preparing for this session, and I actually found that bushfires wasn't a particularly useful term to search. So I would then go back to my mind maps, think, right, let's rethink this idea of bushfires and start looking at things to do with environmental catastrophes and all of those sorts of things. Now, that I will just sort of stress if I kind of go back over here to the actual mind map itself. All these clicks back, never mind. So like if I come back over here, so like bushfires would still be useful because it's the specific thing that I'm interested in doing. But what I might do is do all of this sort of searching over here and say, here's where I might sort of add in things like William Gibson and cyberpunk and all of those sorts of ideas. But then I might go like, okay, cool, like I still want to research bushfires. I still want to go and do a search about habitat loss or atmospheric effects because of bushfires, and that might be something that informs how I use the William Gibson link with regards to this idea of object-oriented ontology, etc., etc., etc. That's sort of the idea. Or I may talk to, like, do interviews with some climate scientists to sort of get their ideas on things, and that sort of then leads here and in here and in here. And that's sort of one of the things to think about with this, is that searching is not static, and that's why this idea of evaluating is such a key thing that you want to be doing when you're doing searches. And then on top of that, what you also want to be doing is you want to be keeping a record of all of the searching you're doing. Like, don't be in a position where you've done your search and you think, cool, that's done, I don't need to worry about it. So, you know, even though I mentioned that I did some searches before using the word bushfires instead of things like catastrophe or catastrophic or anything along those lines, I've got all of those searches written down. Now, part of the reason is that because it'll keep you sane, because the last thing you want to do is wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning and go, did I do this particular search? And then you go back and look and you realize, oh, I actually did do that search and I found nothing. That's one of the reasons why you want to keep it. But it's also a way for you to see how the idea evolves. And that way, if you do find that you go sit down one of the iterations of your searching and find that it's not actually proving very fruitful, you're able to sort of backtrack and go back. You also want to save your searches. You can do this in the various sort of databases we're subscribed to, like ProQuest and EBSCO. You can actually save your searches, so you can actually repeat the searches later on and set up alerts. You know, I often like to create a table where I can sort of have my searches listed and then start recording what I've done and my notes around that. And of course, using something like RefWorks or EndNote is a really, really great way for you to keep your references straight for when you actually do get to the stage where you're writing things up, etc., etc. So that's basically everything that I wanted to sort of cover in this particular session. It's just this idea about getting you to think more about searching. Now, we did a lot of the searching in a more sort of, I suppose, structured environment of the library catalog, library databases, and all of those sorts of things. But these are the same sort of techniques that you can use if you are looking for things that are a bit more specific, that are a little bit broader, and those sorts of things. And I would encourage you to do those searches as well, because that's the only way that you're actually going to be able to find a lot of this sort of stuff. But the idea is the techniques we were using in this can be applied to multiple sort of scenarios and multiple things that you might want to do. In the very, very last segment of this module, I've got some links that will show you where you can go to get more information and some extra help from librarians. You can, of course, email me directly, but if I'm not available or not answering at that particular time, there are other links where you can go and actually chat with librarians to get help as well. So that's probably the biggest thing that I would say take away from today. Don't think of this as, you know, this is one adventure in library land and then nothing more. We're here to constantly help you. That's basically what our job is. So please do actually use the library, you know, because we are a resource that can really help you get the most of your searching. And not just when you're searching the library stuff, but even if you're searching things like, you may be searching the ABS for statistics or searching Google or something along those lines and not finding your search results. Let us know what you're looking for and we'll see what we can do to help you find that. So all the best with your searching, and please use the library.